"You look sad, sir. Would you like to meet my mom?" And the surprised millionaire says yes. He had lost everything: career, fortune, and even the affection of his own daughter. Sitting on a bench, aimless, he heard the phrase that changed his life. That unexpected yes led him to a flower shop, and to a new beginning he never imagined. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The silence in the glass office echoed like a sentence. Richard Armstrong looked through the window of the 30th floor, contemplating the city of New York that stretched infinitely below his feet. Just 3 hours earlier, that same panorama represented his technological empire, his achievements, his power. Now each building seemed to whisper accusations. "Mr. Armstrong," the secretary's voice trembled. "The lawyers are here." He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew that the men in dark suits brought documents that would change his life forever. Tax fraud, shell companies, suspicious financial transactions, words that danced in his mind like ghosts, each carrying the weight of an accusation he still struggled to understand. "Dr. Richard," began the older lawyer, extending a leather folder, "we need to talk about the implications of these investigations. Your company is being audited by the IRS, and there are indications of irregularities dating back to the last 5 years. Richard finally turned around, his pale face contrasting with his impeccable Italian suit. "Irregularities? I personally supervised every important transaction in this company." "That's exactly why your situation is delicate," replied the lawyer, leafing through documents. "Falsified documents were found with your signature. Transfers to offshore accounts that you supposedly authorized. The press is already speculating, and the FBI may issue a search warrant at any moment." Richard's world collapsed in slow motion. Each word from the lawyers sounded distant, as if he were submerged in murky water. He remembered the last few months, the meetings with his partner and best friend, Edward Mitchell. Edward always took care of the more technical and bureaucratic aspects of the company, leaving Richard focused on the strategic vision and important negotiations. "Is Edward aware of this situation?" asked Richard, his voice hoarse. The lawyers exchanged glances. "Mr. Mitchell has claimed complete ignorance of the irregularities. He presented documents that exempt him from any direct responsibility. According to his version, all controversial decisions were made unilaterally by you." Richard felt the floor give way beneath his feet. Edward, the man who had been his daughter's godfather, who had Sunday dinners at his house, who knew every detail of his personal and professional life, had abandoned him at the most critical moment. The following days were a blur of headlines, cameras, microphones being pushed in his direction. TechVision executive accused of million-dollar fraud. Technological empire built on false documents. The fall of the king of American innovation. Every news broadcast, every newspaper, every website repeated his public degradation like a cruel mantra. The call that hurt the most came from his ex-wife, Marianne. Her voice, previously just cold during conversations about their daughter's custody, now carried a tone of disgust he had never heard before. "Richard, you are not going to come near Isabella while this mess isn't resolved," she said categorically. "I don't want my daughter exposed to this media circus. Marianne, please, it's her birthday next week. I promised I'd take her to that French restaurant she loves." "Your promises aren't worth anything anymore, Richard. You built your fortune by lying, and now you want me to trust you with our daughter." The tone of contempt in Marianne's voice echoed in his ears even after she hung up. Isabella, his 12-year-old daughter, the center of his emotional universe, had become one more right he had lost. He imagined the girl watching the news, hearing schoolmates comment about the father who appeared on television as a criminal. His Upper East Side apartment, previously a sanctuary of luxury and comfort, transformed into a golden prison. Neighbors avoided him in the elevator, the building manager greeted him with embarrassment, and even the doorman, who always smiled and asked about his family, now just nodded his head. The nights were the worst. Richard walked through the spacious rooms, surrounded by expensive artwork and designer furniture, feeling more alone than he had ever imagined possible. Each object reminded him of achievements that now seemed built on rotten foundations. The phone stopped ringing, invitations to social events ceased, friends evaporated like morning mist. One morning, after another sleepless night, Richard left home without a destination. He walked through the streets of the city center, observing ordinary people following their simple routines. Workers going to their jobs, mothers taking children to school, retirees chatting on park benches. A world that had always been invisible to him, protected as he was in his bubble of privilege. He stopped at a small park, hidden between commercial buildings. A place he had never noticed despite driving past it hundreds of times. He sat on a simple wooden bench, watching children play while their mothers chatted distractedly. The contrast with his previous life was striking. There were no executives competing for million-dollar contracts, no strategic meetings, no pressure for results. Just life happening in a natural and spontaneous way. That's when she appeared. A girl of about 8 years old, curly hair tied in a messy ponytail, approached him with the typical curiosity of childhood. She wore a simple, flowery dress and worn sneakers that showed evidence of many games and adventures. "Hi," she said, stopping in front of him. "Are you sad?" Richard was surprised by the direct question. It had been weeks since anyone had addressed him so naturally. "A little," he answered, trying to sketch a smile. "My mom always says that when someone is sad, they need to meet nice people. Do you want to meet my mom? She's really nice." The innocence of the child touched something deep in Richard. How long had it been since someone had treated him without judgments, without prejudices, without knowing his story? "Won't your mom be bothered by a stranger? She never minds. Her shop is right over there." She pointed to a small flower shop across the street. "She always says flowers make people happy." Richard looked in the direction indicated by the girl, a small shop with a simple but welcoming facade. Colorful plants and flowers decorated the entrance, creating a vibrant contrast with the surrounding concrete. Through the window, he could see a woman arranging bouquets, her delicate and precise movements betraying years of experience and love for the craft. "My name is Sophie," said the girl, extending a small hand. "What's yours?" "Richard," he replied, shaking her soft little hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Sophie." "Come on, Richard. My mum will like you. She likes everybody." Before he could protest or make up an excuse, Sophie had already taken his hand and was pulling him toward the flower shop. Richard felt a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. For weeks he had been living in isolation, fleeing from judgmental looks and conversations loaded with insinuations. The prospect of meeting someone who didn't know his story was, at the same time, terrifying and liberating. The woman looked up when they entered the shop. She was beautiful in a natural and serene way, brown hair tied in a loose bun, simple but careful clothes. Her eyes revealed a gentle intelligence and a silent strength that Richard immediately recognized. "Mom, this is Richard. He was sad in the park, so I brought him here to meet you." The woman smiled, first at her daughter, then at Richard. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a polite curiosity and a natural kindness. "Hello, Richard. I'm Helen. Sophie is right. Flowers really do have the power to brighten someone's day. Welcome." Richard felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he had forgotten existed. Acceptance, simplicity, genuine humanity. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "Your daughter is very special." "She's my light," replied Helen, caressing Sophie's hair. "And you? Do you work in this area?" The simple question caught him off guard. How to explain that he had lost everything? How to tell her that he was the man in the headlines, the fallen executive, the alleged criminal dominating the news? "I'm going through some professional changes at the moment." Helen nodded, as if understanding there was more to the story, but respecting his privacy. Changes can be difficult, but sometimes they're necessary. "Would you like some coffee? I just made it." The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of flowers created an atmosphere of welcome that Richard hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, he was able to breathe deeply without feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The coffee, served in a simple ceramic mug, had a different taste from everything Richard had experienced in recent years. It wasn't the gourmet coffee from his executive meetings, nor the sophisticated espresso from his business lunches. It was coffee made with care, served with genuine intention to welcome, without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. "Richard, can you help me reach those vases up there?" asked Sophie, pointing to a high shelf. "My mom always tells me not to climb the ladder alone." "Sophie," Helen gently reprimanded, "you barely know Richard. You can't keep asking for favors like that." "It's no problem," said Richard, surprising himself with the readiness of his response. "It would be my pleasure to help. How long had it been since he had felt useful in such a simple and direct way? He carefully picked up the vases, noticing how his hands, accustomed only to holding tablets and signing contracts, adapted to the weight and texture of the ceramic. Sophie applauded, as if he had performed an extraordinary feat. "See, Mum? I told you Richard was nice." Helen observed the interaction with a discreet smile. There was something in the way that well-dressed man responded to her daughter, a gentleness that contrasted with the evident tension in his shoulders. She had developed a sharp instinct for reading people over the years, running the flower shop alone, and Richard sparked her curiosity. During the following hours, Richard remained in the store without even noticing how time passed. He helped reorganize some shelves, listened to Sophie tell stories about each plant, and observed Helen work with a mastery he admired. Her movements were precise, almost meditative, each arrangement created with an attention to detail that revealed years of practice and genuine love for the craft. "I never noticed how each flower has its own personality," commented Richard, watching Helen assemble a bouquet of white roses mixed with green foliage. "People think flowers are just decoration," replied Helen, without taking her eyes off the arrangement. "But each one tells a story. These roses, for example, were chosen for an apology. The customer said he did something terrible and wants to regain his wife's trust. And do you think it will work?" Helen paused her work and looked at him directly. "Flowers don't fix mistakes, Richard, but sometimes they help people find the right words to start the conversation that really matters." The response touched Richard in an unexpected way. He thought of Isabella, of Marianne, of all the difficult conversations he needed to have and didn't know how to start. When was the last time he had given flowers to someone without a special or formal occasion? The end of the afternoon came quickly, and Richard realized he had spent entire hours without thinking about the investigations, the lawyers, the newspaper headlines. The feeling was as strange as it was liberating. "I need to go," he said, reluctant to break the spell of that improvised refuge. "Can you come back tomorrow?" asked Sophie, with the spontaneity typical of children. "There's a new plant arriving that I want to show you." Richard looked at Helen, seeking approval. She nodded with a smile. "You will always be welcome here." That night, in his empty apartment, Richard felt restless. The contrast between the peace he had found in the flower shop and the chaos of his personal life was striking. He turned on the television, only to turn it off immediately when he saw his picture. In a report about executives investigated for corruption, the world out there remained obsessed with his fall, but for a few hours he had managed to completely forget about it. The next morning, without even consciously planning it, his steps led him back to the park and, consequently, to the flower shop. Sophie spotted him through the window and waved enthusiastically, running to open the door before he even arrived. "Richard, you came back. The new plant arrived early today. Want to see?" Helen appeared from the back of the shop carrying a pot with a plant that Richard didn't recognize. "It's a snake plant," she explained. "Some people call it mother-in-law's tongue. It's one of the most resilient plants that exist. It survives in almost any condition, and it even purifies the air." "Why did you choose this plant specifically?" asked Richard, intrigued. "I didn't choose it. It was Sophie who asked me to order it." Helen looked at her daughter with curiosity. "She said it was for someone special." Sophie smiled mysteriously. "It's for you, Richard. Mum always says that everyone needs a plant to take care of, and this one is perfect for someone who's learning to start over." The unexpected gift left Richard speechless. When was the last time someone had thought of him in such a disinterested way? The simple generosity of the girl contrasted brutally with the world of interests and calculations from which he had been banished. "Sophie, I can't accept this," he began, but was interrupted by the child's determination. "Yes, you can. Plants like to be cared for, and you seem like someone who needs to care for something." Helen observed the exchange with growing interest. There was something about that man that aroused her daughter's protective instinct, the same instinct that made her collect injured animals and insist on caring for plants that others considered lost. During the following days, Richard established an unofficial routine at the flower shop. He arrived in the morning, helped with small tasks, chatted with Helen about plants and business, played with Sophie during lunch hour. Gradually, he began to feel less like an intruder and more like part of that small world. It was Helen who first mentioned having seen his face on television. One night after Sophie had gone to sleep in the small apartment above the shop, she prepared tea and sat at the table where they did the day's accounting. "I know who you are, Richard," she said calmly. without accusation in her voice. "I saw your face on the news." Richard felt his stomach sink. The refuge was over. Soon would come the judgment, the rejection, the request for him to stay away from Sophie. "Helen, I can explain it." "You don't need to explain anything to me," she interrupted. "I've known you for a week, and what I've seen is a kind man who treats my daughter with affection and helps me without asking for anything in return. What television says about your past doesn't change that." The unexpected response left Richard emotional. "Aren't you afraid that I might actually be guilty of the accusations?" Helen was silent for a moment, studying his face. "Afraid of what? That you'll steal my flower arrangements? That you'll falsify documents about petunias?" She smiled. "Richard, I raised Sophie alone after her father disappeared. When he found out about the pregnancy, I learned to judge people by their actions, not by their words or reputation. But what if the accusations are true? What if I really did everything they say? Then you'll have to deal with the legal consequences of that, but that doesn't mean you can't be a better person starting today. Everyone deserves a second chance, Richard." That night, Richard stayed awake thinking about Helen's words. For the first time since the beginning of the investigation, someone had separated his humanity from his alleged actions. She saw him as a complete person, capable of growth and change, not just as a newspaper headline. The most impactful revelation came a few days later, during a call from his lawyers. Richard answered the phone in the flower shop itself after asking Helen's permission. "Richard, we have news about the investigation," said the senior lawyer. "We've gained access to detailed records of the suspicious transactions. There's something you need to know about your partner, Edward." What Richard heard in the following minutes completely changed his perspective on the past few years. Edward had not only abandoned him during the crisis, he had orchestrated the entire situation, using the trust and friendship of decades to create a scheme where Richard would appear as the only guilty party. Documents had been falsified with digital signature software. Transfers had been authorized using passwords that only Edward knew, but were registered as if they were made by Richard. The man who had been his daughter's godfather, who knew his personal codes and had full access to his trust, had methodically constructed his destruction. When he hung up the phone, Richard was shaking. Helen approached, concerned about his expression. "Did something happen?" "My best friend," he managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. "He planned everything. He used me as a front and then abandoned me to face the consequences alone." Helen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Richard. It must be terrible to discover that. 20 years of friendship," he whispered. "He knew my family, my dreams, my fears, and he used all of that against me." Sophie, who had heard part of the conversation, approached and hugged Richard around the waist. "Sometimes people do bad things," she said with the unexpected wisdom of children, "but that doesn't mean you're bad too." The girl's hug, combined with Helen's silent support, helped Richard process the devastating revelation. He had been betrayed in the most profound way possible, but for the first time since the beginning of everything, he had also found people who believed in his fundamental goodness. 3 weeks after the revelation about Edward, Richard woke up in the small apartment above the flower shop. Helen had insisted that he stay there temporarily, especially after photographers began to watch his building in the Upper East Side. The space was simple but welcoming. A sofa bed in the living room, a small table in the kitchen, and windows that gave a view to an inner courtyard where Sophie fed birds every morning. The aroma of flowers rose up the wooden stairs, mixing with the smell of coffee that Helen always prepared before opening the shop. Richard had developed a morning routine that included helping with the arrangement of bouquets, checking online orders, and assisting with the financial calculations of the small business. "You have a natural ability with numbers," commented Helen one morning, watching him reorganize the inventory control spreadsheets. "You managed to optimize our system in just a few days." Richard smiled shyly. "It's years of administrative experience. At least my education serves for something useful." "It serves for many useful things," replied Helen, gently touching his arm. "You just needed to find the right context to apply it." The growing closeness between them was palpable, but both maintained a respectful distance. Helen had been hurt in the past and had learned to protect her heart. Richard, in turn, still carried the weight of guilt and shame, feeling unworthy of anyone's affection. Sophie, however, did not have these adult reservations. She had completely adopted Richard, including him in her routines, asking for his help with homework, and insisting that he participate in her games in the park. "Richard, can you pick me up from school today?" she asked one morning while they were having coffee together. "The teacher said we can bring someone special to talk about professions." Helen frowned. "Sophie, we can't bother Richard with that. He has important things to resolve." "Actually," said Richard, surprised by his own response, "I'd love to go. It's been a long time since I've been around children Sophie's age." The afternoon at school was revealing. Richard observed Sophie interact with her classmates, proudly introducing him as her friend who lives at home and takes care of the plants. The other children asked innocent questions about his work, and he found himself explaining entrepreneurship in a simple and inspiring way. "Are you rich?" a boy asked directly. Richard paused, thinking about the answer. Months ago, he would have talked about net worth and investments. Now, looking at Sophie, who smiled proudly at his side, he replied, "I'm rich in true friendships, which is the most difficult type of wealth to obtain." The teacher was impressed with his improvised lecture on the importance of starting over and learning new things. On the way back, Sophie held his hand and said, "You were the best presenter of all." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Richard and Helen talked in the small kitchen. She had prepared a simple but thoughtful dinner, and they shared a bottle of wine that he had bought as a thank you. "You're good with children," observed Helen. "Do you have any?" "A daughter, Isabella. She's 12 years old." Richard's voice became melancholic. "I haven't seen her in 2 months. My ex-wife prohibited visits until this whole legal situation is resolved." "That must be very difficult." "It's the most painful part of all this. I can accept losing money, prestige, even freedom if necessary, but losing the right to be a father to my daughter." His voice failed. Helen came closer and touched his hand. "When all this is over, you'll recover that relationship. Children have an incredible capacity to forgive parents who truly care." Helen's touch sent an electric current through Richard's arm. They looked at each other for a moment, the accumulated tension of the last few weeks hanging in the air between them. Slowly, he leaned in to kiss her, but she gently moved away. "Richard, I need to be honest with you. I'm developing feelings, but I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of getting involved with someone who might disappear from my life when he manages to solve his problems. Sophie has already become very attached to you. I'm becoming attached too. If you decide to go back to your previous world..." Richard held her hands between his. "Helen, my previous world no longer exists, and even if it did, I don't know if I would want to go back to it. These last few months have shown me that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way I was living. But you're still an executive, Richard. When you're exonerated, they'll offer opportunities, money, power. How can I compete with that?" "You're not competing with anything," he replied, looking directly into her eyes. "You gave me back something I didn't even know I had lost. The ability to feel truly useful and valued for who I am, not for what I own." They finally kissed, a sweet and careful kiss, loaded with promises and uncertainties. When they separated, Helen rested her forehead against his. "Promise we'll take it slow. Because of Sophie, and because of my heart." "I promise," whispered Richard. The following days were marked by a new family dynamic. Richard formalized his participation in the flower shop business, using his knowledge to expand online sales and improve financial management. Helen taught him about plants, about the secrets of flower arrangements, about how to read the needs of each customer. Sophie thrived with the male presence at home. She had created small rituals that included Richard. He helped her with math, she taught him about different species of flowers, and together they took care of a small garden in the back courtyard. The tranquility was broken when unexpected news arrived through his lawyers. Edward had finally been arrested, but not before attempting one last desperate move. He had tried to link the flower shop to a money laundering scheme, claiming that Richard was using Helen's business to hide resources. "This is ridiculous," said Helen, reading the notification that Richard had received. "Our financial transactions are completely transparent." "Edward knows my tendency to get emotionally involved with projects," explained Richard, clearly disturbed. "He's trying to use our closeness to implicate you in the scheme. And what does that mean for us? It means I need to distance myself from here. I can't allow you and Sophie to be harmed by association with me." Helen stood up abruptly. "No, I won't let this man destroy one more part of your life. If he wants war, we'll give him war." Helen's determination surprised Richard. She called a lawyer she knew in the area, organized all the financial documents of the flower shop, and demanded a complete audit of the last 2 years to prove the absolute legitimacy of her business. "Why are you doing this?" asked Richard, touched by the unexpected loyalty. "Because someone needs to fight for you, since you've spent your entire life trusting the wrong people," she replied firmly. "And because Sophie and I are not going to let you face this alone." That night, after a full day dealing with lawyers and auditors, they sat in the small back courtyard. Sophie was sleeping soundly, exhausted from helping organize documents she didn't fully understand, but knowing they were important to save Richard. "Do you realize you could lose customers by publicly associating with me?" said Richard, observing the stars that managed to shine even with the light pollution of the city. "I might lose some prejudiced ones, but I'll gain customers who value loyalty and justice," replied Helen, resting her head on his shoulder. "Besides, plants don't judge. They just grow when they're well cared for." Richard laughed for the first time in weeks. "Do you always have a botanical metaphor for everything?" "It's my specialty. Sophie inherited that from me. Yesterday she said you're like an oak tree. It takes time to grow, but when it does, it's the most beautiful thing in the world." They remained silent, appreciating the temporary peace. Richard knew the next few days would be difficult, with interrogations, investigations, and renewed public exposure. But for the first time since the beginning of the entire ordeal, he didn't feel alone. The moment was interrupted by a light turning on in the window of the neighboring apartment. An elderly woman appeared in the window and waved to them. "Mrs. Cecilia," whispered Helen. "She always stays up late, taking care of her cats." The lady came down and approached the low fence that divided the courtyards. "Helen, dear, I saw on television today. This young man who's with you is that businessman, isn't he?" Richard prepared himself for another confrontation, but Mrs. Cecilia surprised them both. "I want you to know that I don't believe anything they're saying. I've seen how you treat Sophie, how you help Helen with the heavy plants. A bad man doesn't have patience with children or care for flowers." The simplicity of the neighbor's observation touched Richard deeply. In a world of complex analyses, sophisticated investigations, and media speculation, a 70-year-old lady had arrived at the truth through simple observation of everyday gestures. "Thank you, Mrs. Cecilia," he managed to say, emotional. "You're welcome, son. And Helen, if you need anything during all this confusion, just call. Neighbors help each other." After the lady retired, Helen held Richard's hand. "See, you're not alone. You have a family here, and a community that has already learned to value you." Richard squeezed her hand, feeling a mixture of gratitude and hope. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, he began to believe that perhaps he could not only survive that storm, but emerge from it as a better person. 6 months after the complete audit of the flower shop, Richard was in court hearing the judge pronounce the words that changed his life forever. "Considering the evidence presented, I declare the defendant, Richard Armstrong, innocent of all charges of tax fraud. The true responsible party for the crimes was his former partner, Edward Mitchell, who has already been duly convicted." The relief was so intense that Richard needed to lean on the table. His lawyers were smiling, but he could only think of Helen and Sophie, who were in the audience hugging and crying with joy. When he left the court, they were waiting for him on the stairs. "Daddy Richard!" shouted Sophie, using the nickname she had naturally adopted in recent weeks. She ran into his arms, and he lifted her in the air, spinning while she laughed. Helen approached, her eyes shining with tears. "I knew this would happen. I always knew." They kissed right there in front of the journalists and cameras, not caring about anything beyond that moment of shared victory. In the following weeks, Richard was approached by several companies offering executive positions. $1 million proposals arrived daily, but each corporate conversation left him more certain that this was no longer his path. "Are you sure you want to refuse Microsoft's offer?" asked Helen one night while they were having dinner. "It's a lot of money, Richard." "I'm absolutely sure," he replied, playing with Sophie's hair, who had fallen asleep in his lap while they watched a movie. "I learned that there are more valuable things than money." "Like what?" "Like waking up every day, knowing that my work makes a difference in people's lives. Like having time to teach math to an amazing girl. Like building something genuine with the woman I love." Helen smiled, but Richard noticed a concern in her eyes. "What is it?" "It's just, when you talk about building something, I don't know if you're referring only to our relationship or to something more concrete." Richard laughed and picked up a folder that was on the table. "Actually, I have a proposal for you, a business proposal." He opened the folder, revealing a detailed project. How about transforming the flower shop into something bigger? A community center that combines flowers, a cafe, workshops for the community, and urban sustainability projects. Helen examined the drawings and spreadsheets with growing excitement. "Richard, this is amazing, but it must cost a fortune. I'm going to sell my apartment in the Upper East Side. With that money, we can buy the entire building, renovate it, and still have working capital for the first few years." "You would do that? Give up all that luxury?" "Helen, that apartment was never a home. It was just an expensive place where I slept between meetings. Here is where I found a family." Sophie chose that moment to wake up. "What are you talking about?" "We're talking about expanding our flower shop," explained Helen, showing the drawings to her daughter. "And can I have my own little corner to teach other children about plants?" "Of course you can," replied Richard. "In fact, that was one of the first things I thought of when I created the project." Sophie jumped with joy, already imagining the possibilities. But the real surprise came a few weeks later, when an unexpected visit arrived at the flower shop. "Dad?" Isabella, now 13 years old, was standing at the door of the shop, shy and uncertain. Richard felt his heart speed up. He hadn't seen his daughter in almost a year. She had grown, changed, and for a moment he feared that she wouldn't want to approach him anymore. "Hi, Izzy," he said softly, using the affectionate nickname from when she was little. "Mom said I can visit you, if you want," whispered Isabella, looking around the shop with curiosity. "If I want? Sweetheart, there's nothing in the world I want more." Sophie, who had observed the arrival of the older girl, approached bravely. "Are you Isabella? Your dad talks about you every day." Isabella looked at Sophie with interest. "And you're Sophie? He talks a lot about you too." The first meeting was tense, but Sophie had a natural talent for breaking barriers. In a few minutes, she was showing Isabella how to care for plants, telling stories about daily life in the flower shop, and including her half-sister in her everyday activities. "She's very much like you when you were little," commented Helen to Richard, watching the girls play in the courtyard. "Do you think they'll get along?" "I'm sure they will. Children are wiser than adults about these things." The coexistence between the families was gradually established. Marianne, Richard's ex-wife, initially resisted the idea of Isabella frequenting the flower shop, but changed her mind when she saw how her daughter had become more cheerful and communicative. "I don't know what you did to her," said Marianne during a phone conversation, "but Isabella is happier than I've seen her in a long time. We just give her what every child deserves: attention, affection, and an environment where she can be authentic," replied Richard. The great project of expanding the flower shop materialized at the end of the year. The new space included the original store, a cozy cafe, rooms for workshops, and a community garden on the terrace. The inauguration was an event that brought together the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Cecilia was one of the first to arrive, bringing a homemade cake. "I always knew you would do something special," she said, hugging Helen and Richard. The girls, now inseparable despite the age difference, had prepared a presentation on urban sustainability and the importance of plants in people's lives. Isabella, who had inherited her father's strategic intelligence, had created detailed slides. Sophie, with her natural creativity, had prepared practical demonstrations with different species of plants. "My dad always says that people are like plants," said Sophie into the microphone, surprising everyone with her naturalness. "Some need a lot of sun, others like shade. Some need a lot of water, others prefer dry soil. But all need care and affection to grow." The audience applauded emotionally, and Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. That 8-year-old girl had articulated better than any business consultant the philosophy that now guided his life. The success of the new venture exceeded all expectations. In a few months, they became a reference in the region, not only for flowers, but for composting workshops, support groups for single mothers, and educational projects with local schools. Richard discovered a new passion: lecturing at universities about business ethics and the importance of finding purpose in work. His presentations always included the story of his fall and rebirth, inspiring young entrepreneurs to build sustainable and humane businesses. "True wealth," he would say in his lectures, "is not in what you accumulate, but in what you build together with the people you love." Helen also flourished in the new environment. Her knowledge of medicinal plants and sustainable floral design attracted the attention of researchers and environmentalists. She began teaching courses at universities and participating in international conferences, always carrying with her the philosophy that caring for nature is caring for humanity. The marriage proposal happened in a simple and natural way during an ordinary afternoon at the flower shop. Richard was teaching a group of children about the life cycle of plants when Sophie asked, "Richard, are you going to marry my mom?" The girl's direct question caught everyone by surprise. Helen blushed, the other children laughed, and Richard realized that this was the perfect moment. "Sophie, that depends on your mother accepting," he said, kneeling beside the girl and taking a small ring from his pocket. "Helen, do you accept officially building a family with me?" "I do," whispered Helen, with tears in her eyes. Isabella, who was watching the scene, ran to hug her father. "Finally, I was getting impatient waiting for you to decide." The wedding was celebrated in the terrace garden, surrounded by the plants that had witnessed Richard's rebirth. The ceremony was simple, with only close family members and friends from the community. Sophie was the maid of honor. Isabella read a poem she had written especially for the occasion, and Mrs. Cecilia cried more than the bride and groom themselves. 2 years later, the family was gathered on the terrace to celebrate the anniversary of the renovated flower shop. The oak tree they had planted on the day of the inauguration now offered generous shade, its branches extending like welcoming arms over the small urban oasis they had created. Richard observed his daughters, because now Sophie was officially his adopted daughter, playing among the plants while Helen prepared dinner. Isabella, at 15, was already talking about studying biology to follow in her stepmother's footsteps. Sophie, at 10, dreamed of having her own flower shop when she grew up. "I'm thinking that if someone had told me 3 years ago that my happiness would depend on plants and children, I would have laughed in their face. And now? Now I know that the richest life I can have is this one. Waking up every day next to the woman I love, seeing our daughters grow up happy and healthy, and knowing that our work makes the world a little bit better." The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, the colors reflecting in the windows of the surrounding buildings. "What are you thinking about?" asked Helen, approaching and resting her head on his shoulder. In the garden, the plants swayed gently with the afternoon breeze, and the sound of the girls' laughter echoed like music. Richard Armstrong had lost an empire built on fragile foundations, but had found something much more valuable, a family built on love, respect, and mutual growth. That night, after the girls were asleep, Richard and Helen sat on the bench they had placed under the oak tree. In his hands, he held a book he had just finished writing. "Flowers in the Storm, A Journey of Fall and Rebirth." "Do you think people will be interested in our story?" he asked. "I'm sure they will," replied Helen. "Everyone needs to know that it's possible to start over, that it's possible to find beauty even after losing everything." Richard closed the book and looked at the stars that shone timidly among the city lights. He thought about the journey he had traveled, from the arrogance of financial success to the despair of the fall, from the isolation of rejection to the embrace of true love. Each scar on his soul had transformed into wisdom. Each loss had opened space for unimaginable gains. The next day, a new family would arrive to participate in the gardening workshops. Children would laugh among the plants, adults would learn about sustainability and cooperation, and the cycle of care and growth would continue. Richard Armstrong had learned that true wealth was not in the numbers of a bank account, but in the ability to cultivate life, love, and hope in a world that sometimes seems too arid to flourish. And so, under the stars and surrounded by the scent of nocturnal flowers, he smiled, knowing he had found not just a new purpose, but a new way of existing, a way where each day was an opportunity to sow kindness and harvest genuine happiness. The end of the story. Dear readers, we hope that the journey of Richard, Helen, and Sophie has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours in creating this narrative. This story reminds us that sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what really matters in life. If you were moved by this story of new beginnings and true love, don't forget to like this content and share it with people who also need to believe that it's possible to flourish after the greatest storms. Leave in the comments your own stories of overcoming and rebirth. Each account is a seed of hope for other hearts that are going through difficult times. Subscribe to our channel to receive more stories that celebrate the human strength to reinvent oneself and find beauty even in the darkest moments. Until the next story, Keep cultivating love and hope in your lives.